Frank Miller, an 84-year-old Korean war pilot, stands alone at Edwards Air Force Base's air show, unnoticed by the selfie-obsessed crowd, haunted by a 1953 dogfight and a heroic rescue with no recognition. He clings to his faded squadron cap and a small flag. This year, a young man, grandson of a crew chief Frank saved, spots him. Meanwhile, F-22 pilot Lieutenant Kyle Jennings, researching forgotten heroes, plans a daring tribute. As the jet roars overhead, an unexpected wingdip salutes Frank, stirring memories and silencing the crowd. What happens next unveils a legacy long overdue, leaving everyone breathless. Share their tales of courage and legacy. Drop a comment with someone you'd salute in silence, or type Semper Fi to join us in celebrating quiet valor. Support our channel. Let's keep history's stories alive, one voice at a time. Frank Miller, now 84, carried the weight of his years with a quiet grace. Decades ago, in the crucible of the Korean War, he'd piloted an F-86 Sabre, slicing through the sky in a dogfight that stretched an agonizing 37 minutes in 1953. His aircraft, battered and limping, had barely held together as he coaxed it through an emergency landing, his hands steady despite the chaos. That day, he'd pulled two comrades from the jaws of enemy fire, their faces etched with terror and gratitude he'd never forget. No medals came his way, no letters of commendation, just transfer orders and a ticket home. The military life ended for him then, a chapter closed with a finality that still echoed in his bones. After his discharge, Frank settled in a small town in Northern California, a place where the world moved slowly and left him alone. He shunned veteran organizations, their camaraderie too heavy with memories he preferred to keep buried. To the locals, he was simply the quiet man who tinkered with vintage radios in his cluttered garage, his fingers deftly reviving relics of a bygone era. He never spoke of the war, never shared the stories that haunted his dreams. But every year, without fail, he made a pilgrimage to Edwards Air Force Base for the annual air show, a ritual as sacred as any he had ever known. Frank went alone. His wife, the love of his life, had passed years ago, leaving a void that time never quite filled. His son, busy with a career in a distant city, rarely visited, and his grandson had grown up in a world far removed from Frank's own. Yet none of that deterred him. Each year, he claimed the same spot by the western fence, Section 4, beside the auxiliary flagpole. His hands, gnarled but steady, clutched a small paper flag, and his eyes, dimmed by age but still searching, followed every aircraft that roared overhead. He didn't cheer or record the spectacle like the crowds around him. He simply stood, a solitary figure rooted in a moment no one else could fathom, a survivor of the Kaesong airspace where life and death had danced too close. His mornings followed an unshakable routine. At dawn, Frank rose, the ache in his joints a familiar companion. He brewed black coffee in a chipped mug that had seen better days, its cracks a map of years gone by. Settling into his worn armchair, he read yesterday's newspaper, savoring the simplicity of small-town news. Then, with a reverence reserved for sacred things, he placed his old F-86 squadron cap on his head. The cap, once olive green, had faded to a weathered gray, its squadron patch barely discernible. To Frank, it was more than fabric. It was a relic of survival, a tangible link to the skies over Korea and the men who'd flown beside him. The drive to Edwards took an hour and 20 minutes from his modest home on Maple Street. Behind the wheel of his aging Toyota pickup, Frank let country music fill the cab, its twang a backdrop to the memories that flickered like old film reels in his mind. He thought of Rodriguez, his wingman, whose laughter had been silenced in 1952, a loss that still stung. He remembered Captain Morrison, whose lessons on reading enemy formations had saved his life more than once. And he recalled the ground crew chief, a wiry man with a knack for keeping their battered planes aloft when parts were scarce. Most of all, Frank's thoughts lingered on that final mission, the one that left him with nightmares and a quiet certainty that he'd done what was required, no matter the cost. At Edwards, the parking lot buzzed with families, tourists, and aviation buffs toting cameras worth more than Frank's truck. He parked in the back, away from the chaos, and began his slow walk to the flight line. His knees groaned with every step, but he refused the cane his doctor had prescribed. Fighter pilots, he had always believed, carried themselves with dignity until the end. As he neared Section 4, he noticed the air show had drawn a bigger crowd this year. The media had hyped it relentlessly, and the audience skewed younger, louder, more focused on capturing the perfect social media post than soaking in the spectacle above. A family had staked out the spot directly in front of his usual place, their folding chairs and picnic blanket claiming the prime real estate. The father, phone in hand, was live streaming, his voice cutting through the din as he narrated for an audience that would never grasp the weight of what they were seeing. Frank didn't mind. He'd learned long ago that the best view wasn't always the front row. Sometimes the truest perspective came from standing quietly in the shadows, watching the world through eyes that had witnessed both its wonders and its horrors. He slipped the small paper flag from his jacket pocket, its edges worn from years of careful handling. Around him, the crowd swelled, their excitement a stark contrast to his stillness. This year's air show was the grandest in Edwards' history. Tickets sold out weeks in advance, the air crackling with an energy Frank had never felt here before. When he reached Section 4, he found it transformed. A group of enthusiasts had set up an elaborate encampment, rows of folding chairs, tables laden with gear, and tripods poised for the perfect shot. Frank stood at the edge of it all, his flag in hand, his cap low over his eyes. In that moment, he wasn't just an old man in a crowd. He was a pilot again, feeling the weight of the cockpit, the roar of the Sabre, the fleeting eternity of those 37 minutes over Kaesong. He thought of the men who hadn't come home, their faces as vivid now as they'd been then. He felt the ache of survival, the guilt of outliving so many, and the quiet pride of having faced the fire and walked away. The aircraft thundered above, and Frank's gaze followed, his heart tethered to the sky. To the crowd, he was invisible. To himself, he was whole. The air buzzed with anticipation, a vibrant hum weaving through the crowd gathered for the air show. Professional cameras perched proudly on tripods, their lenses glinting in the midday sun, while portable speakers blared patriotic tunes, stirring a collective sense of pride. Frank stood quietly, his weathered hands clutching a small American flag, its edges frayed from years of use. His faded squadron cap, a relic from another era, sat low on his brow, shielding eyes that had seen more than most could imagine. The weight of those years pressed against his chest, a familiar ache of being overlooked, of standing on the fringes of a world that had moved on without him. A sudden scuffle broke his reverie. A child from the family in front of him, caught up in the chase for a bright red balloon, stumbled backward, by Bargard, his small sneakers scuffing Frank's polished shoes. The boy's mother glanced over her shoulder, her face flickering with a fleeting, "Oops, sorry," before she turned back to her phone, her fingers dancing across the screen to capture the moment for her Instagram story. The air show, with its roaring jets and dazzling displays, was her amazing experience, and she was determined to broadcast it to the world. Frank didn't flinch. He was used to this. The casual dismissal, the way people's eyes slid past him as if he were part of the scenery. He adjusted his stance, his grip tightening on the flag, and let the moment pass. Invisibility had become his companion, a bitter reminder that the history he'd helped shape was now just a backdrop for selfies and social media. Nearby, a group of young Air Force personnel strode by, their crisp demonstration team uniforms a stark contrast to Frank's faded attire. They moved with purpose, their voices waved with excitement as they chattered about the upcoming F-22 performance. Their confidence was palpable, a youthful energy that reminded Frank of days long gone. But as they passed, not one of them spared him a glance. One airman, barely 19, was so engrossed in snapping a selfie with his comrades that he stepped backward, nearly colliding with Frank's shoulder. "Watch it, Grandpa," the young man muttered, his eyes never leaving his phone as he angled for the perfect shot. The words stung, though Frank didn't show it. He steadied himself against the chain-link fence, his fingers curling around the cold metal as memories flooded back. In his mind's eye, he was 19 again, climbing into the cockpit of an F-86 Sabre. His hands trembled then, not from age but from the raw adrenaline of knowing each mission could be his last. The roar of engines, the crackle of radio chatter, the weight of knowing some of his squadron wouldn't return. It was a world these young airmen could never fathom. To them, Frank was just an old man, a relic taking up space in their vibrant present. Their wars were fought on screens, their battles won with likes and shares. They'd never heard the scream of artillery or watched a wingsman's plane erupt into flames against a foreign sky. Frank's heart tightened, not with anger, but with a quiet sorrow for the distance between their worlds. As the crowd swelled, Frank found himself nudged further from the fence line. The family in front, with their elaborate setup, had claimed their territory with an almost military precision. Folding tables groaned under the weight of snacks and drinks, their sprawl encroaching on the space Frank had occupied for years. He cleared his throat, his voice soft but steady. "Excuse me," he said to the father who was scrolling through his phone. "I've been standing in this spot for many years. Would it be possible?" The man looked up, his expression a mix of impatience and irritation. "Look, we got here early to claim this spot," he said, cutting Frank off. "There's plenty of room further back." The dismissal was sharp, final. Frank nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line, and stepped back without protest. He'd learned long ago that some fights weren't worth the energy. The world had changed, and he was no longer its center. He moved to a spot behind the crowd, the flag still clutched in his hand, its colors a quiet anchor to his past. But then, something unexpected broke through the haze of his solitude. A young man, maybe 25, approached him, his steps hesitant but deliberate. He wore a vintage military jacket, its patches worn but proud, and clutched an old black and white photograph in his hands, his eyes, wide with curiosity, fixed on Frank's squadron cap. "Sir," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the din of the crowd, "I couldn't help but notice your cap. Is that from Korea?" Frank studied the young man, searching for any hint of mockery, but found only genuine interest. "Yes, son," he replied, his voice steady but warm. 51st Fighter Wing." The young man's eyes widened further, and he glanced down at the photograph, then back at Frank, his hands trembling slightly. "This might sound crazy, sir, but my grandfather left me some old military photos. One of them has a pilot named Frank Miller. The date on the back says 1953. Frank's breath caught in his throat, a wave of emotion surging through him. "What was your grandfather's name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Technical Sergeant Robert Chen," the young man replied. "He worked ground crew for the fighter squadrons." Frank's weathered face broke into a smile, the first genuine one he'd worn in months. The name unlocked a flood of memories. Bobby Chen, the wiry kid from San Francisco, always tinkering, always keeping their planes in the air when the odds said they shouldn't fly. "Bobby Chen," Frank said, his voice thick with nostalgia. "Little Bobby from San Francisco. He kept our birds flying when everyone said it was impossible." The young man's hands shook as he held out the photograph. It was a faded black and white image, capturing a moment frozen in time. A group of pilots and ground crew standing proud in front of an F-86. Frank's eyes locked onto the figure in the center. Himself, impossibly young, his face unlined, his posture brimming with the reckless confidence of youth. And there, kneeling in the front row, was Bobby Chen, his grin as bright as Frank remembered. The young man's voice trembled as he spoke. "He talked about you, sir. He said you saved his life during a raid on the airfield. Said you came back for him when he was trapped under a damaged aircraft." Frank took the photograph gently, his fingers tracing the edges as memories rushed back. The chaos of that day, the deafening roar of enemy fire, the acrid smell of burning fuel, the weight of Bobby's arms slung over his shoulder as he dragged him to safety. "Your grandfather was a good man," Frank said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "One of the best mechanics I ever worked with." He handed the photo back, his eyes meeting the young man's. For the first time that day, he felt seen, not as an old man taking up space, but as a piece of a shared history, a bridge to a past that still mattered. The young man pulled out his phone, his expression a mix of awe and nervousness. "Sir, would you mind if I know this sounds strange, but I'm actually here to meet someone." He hesitated as if the weight of the moment was too much to articulate. Frank's heart swelled, a flicker of hope igniting in the quiet corners of his soul. Maybe, just maybe, the past wasn't as forgotten as he'd thought. The sun scorched the tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base, its heat rising in waves that blurred the horizon. Frank Miller stood among the crowd, his weathered face etched with lines that told stories no one asked to hear. His old military cap, faded to a soft gray, tilted slightly on his head, a quiet nod to a life once lived at full throttle. At 82, his body carried the weight of years, but his spine stayed straight, as if refusing to bow to time. He came to the air show every year, pulled by the rumble of engines and the sharp scent of jet fuel that yanked him back to 1953, Korea, where the sky was both battlefield and sanctuary. Today, though, a strange unease stirred in his chest. A young man, Robert Chen's grandson, had found him earlier, his words careful but heavy. "Lieutenant Kyle Jennings has been researching Korean War veterans, sir. I think he's looking for you." Frank's heart had skipped, caught off guard. Why me, he thought, the question looping through his mind like a plane caught in a holding pattern. He was just a pilot who'd done his job. No medals, no headlines. What could anyone want with a name buried in the past? The loudspeakers snapped to life, their static cutting through the crowd's murmur. "Ladies and gentlemen, turn your eyes to the runway for today's main event, the United States Air Force F-22 Raptor." Cheers exploded, a tidal wave of excitement that Frank barely registered. His gaze locked on the jet, its sleek, angular form glinting under the sun. It was a predator, nothing like the lumbering sabres he'd flown over Korea's jagged mountains. For a moment, he was 26 again, strapped into a cockpit, the world reduced to the hum of his engine and the weight of his choices. Missions that felt like death sentence, skies thick with flak and fear. He'd survived them all, but not without cost. His fingers tightened around the small flag in his hand, the star and stripes worn but unfaded. Someone in that jet knew his name. The thought hit him like a gust of wind, stirring pride and doubt in equal measure. What did they know, and why did it matter now? Inside the F-22's cockpit, Lieutenant Kyle Jennings moved through his pre-flight checks with the ease of muscle memory. The jet's twin engines thrummed, their power coursing through the airframe and into his bones, a reminder of the machine's raw strength. But his mind was elsewhere, tangled in the stories he'd uncovered over weeks of digging through archives. His grandfather, a mechanic in the 51st Fighter Wing, had filled his boyhood with tales of pilots who flew outdated planes into impossible odds. One name had stood out, sharp and unshakable: Frank Miller. No decorations marked Miller's record, no ceremonies had crowned him, but his mission logs painted a picture of a man who'd faced hell and kept flying. A pilot who'd gone back for Bobby Chen when the airfield was a firestorm, risking his own life for a brother in arms. Kyle's grandfather had spoken of Miller with a reverence reserved for the truest kind of hero, the kind who didn't ask for glory. The day before, a message from Robert Chen's grandson had come through, urgent and precise. Frank Miller might be at the air show, Section 4, Western Fence. My grandfather always wanted to thank him properly. The words had lit a fire in Kyle's chest, a need to do something real, something that honored the past. Deviating from the approved flight plan was a gamble. His career hung in the balance. But the risk felt small compared to the debt he carried. Not just to Miller, but to the unspoken pact between pilots, where courage spoke louder than words. As the F-22 surged down the runway, the thrill of takeoff hit him, the moment when metal and will defied gravity. He imagined his grandfather watching, his calloused hands clapping, his eyes bright with pride. This flight wasn't for the crowd or the brass. It was for the ghosts of the 51st, for the men who'd fought and faded into silence. Kyle's eyes flicked to his helmet's display, scanning the crowd below. Section 4, Western Fence. There he was, Frank Miller, standing apart, a small flag in his hand, his cap a badge of battles long past. Kyle's throat tightened, emotion threatening to crack his focus. Miller looked exactly as he'd pictured. Proud, solitary, a man the world had overlooked, but whose courage still burned bright to those who knew where to look. "Control, this is Raptor 1, beginning second demonstration pass," Kyle radioed, his voice calm despite the storm inside. "Roger, Raptor 1, cleared for standard sequence," Control replied. But Kyle's hands tightened on the controls. The standard sequence could wait. This pass was for Frank Miller, for Bobby Chen, for a debt that demanded to be paid in the language of the sky. On the ground, Frank watched the F-22 carve through the air, its precision a testament to engineering and nerve. He'd flown machines like that once, not as sleek, but just as unforgiving. where every mission tested the line between skill and fate. The jet's roar stirred something deep in him, a mix of pride and loss that twisted like a knife. He remembered the weight of his own cockpit, the way the world shrank to instinct and action. Beside him, Robert Chen's grandson stood close, his voice soft but clear. "He knows you're here, Mr. Miller. Lieutenant Jennings asked me to watch for your reaction." Frank's frown deepened, his mind racing to make sense of it. Reaction to what? The question hung heavy as the F-22 began its second pass, its engines a thunder that seemed to shake the decades loose. The sky was more than a stage now, it was a bridge across time, carrying the weight of gratitude, of debts unpaid, of courage that had never needed a spotlight. Frank's heart beat faster, not with fear but with a fragile, stubborn hope. Maybe the past wasn't as forgotten as he'd believed. Maybe in the roar of that jet, someone was finally saying thank you. As the F-22 Raptor roared closer, its sleek form slicing through the sky, something felt off, different in a way that sent a shiver down the spines of those watching. The jet was lower than usual, far below the standard demonstration altitude, its trajectory sharp and deliberate, as if guided by an unspoken purpose. In the cockpit, Kyle gripped the controls with hands steady as stone, but his heart thundered in his chest, a wild drumbeat of adrenaline and resolve. He'd run this maneuver countless times in simulators, perfecting every angle, every second of timing. But this was no simulation. This was real, raw, and against every regulation in the book. Grounding, reprimands, the end of his career, they loomed like storm clouds. But Kyle didn't care. Not today. Not for this. "Raptor 1, you're deviating from the approved flight path," crackled the voice from air traffic control, sharp with concern. Kyle's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Instead, he adjusted the F-22's approach, aligning it with surgical precision towards Section 4 of the western fence. His eyes flicked to the instruments, then to the horizon, every nerve alight with focus. This wasn't just a flight. This was a mission, one he'd never trained for but felt in his bones. Below, Frank Miller stood rooted to the ground, his weathered hands clutching a small paper flag, its edges frayed from years of being carried to air shows. At 92, his frame was frail, but his eyes burned with the fire of memory. Korea, 1952. The frozen mountains, the roar of his P-51 Mustang, the terror of flak bursting around him. 30 years of service, countless missions, and yet no parade had ever marched for his squadron. No politician had spoken his name in grand speeches about valor. The world had moved on, but Frank hadn't. Each year he returned to this air show, to Section 4, hoping not for glory, but for a flicker of recognition, a moment to feel that his sacrifices hadn't been forgotten. Today, as the F-22's shadow loomed, something in his chest stirred, a quiet hope he barely dared to name. Kyle's moment arrived. The jet was perfectly aligned with Frank's position, the timing flawless. With a steady hand, he tilted the F-22's left wing downward at a precise 20-degree angle, nose slightly dipped, holding the position for 3 heartbeats. It was a salute, a gesture as old as aviation itself, born in the days when pilots tipped their wings to honor comrades. This wasn't just a maneuver, it was a conversation, a bridge across decades from one pilot to another. The F-22, a marvel of modern engineering, seemed to bow before the elderly man below, its roar a hymn of respect. From the ground, the sight was breathtaking. The crowd at Section 4, usually buzzing with chatter and flashing phone screens, fell into a stunned hush. A Vietnam veteran nearby, his cap worn thin by time, slowly removed it and pressed it to his chest, his eyes glistening. A young mother who moments before had been filming the jet's approach let her phone drop to her side, her face softened by awe. Even the family who had unknowingly taken Frank's usual spot turned to look at him. The father, who earlier had brushed off the old man as just another spectator, now saw something more, a living testament to courage, a man who had earned this moment through blood and fire. Frank's knees trembled as the jet's salute washed over him. Tears carved paths down his weathered cheeks, each one carrying the weight of 70 years. Years of silence, of forgotten battles, of carrying the flag to air shows with no expectation but to remember. This was different. This was the sky itself speaking to him, acknowledging the missions over Korea, the friends lost, the nights spent wondering if he'd see another dawn. His hands shook as he gripped the flag tighter, its faded colors suddenly vivid with meaning. For the first time since he'd left the cockpit all those years ago, Frank felt seen. In the air traffic control tower, Colonel Marcus Webb lowered his binoculars, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The radio buzzed with voices, other pilots, stirred by what they'd witnessed. "Control, this is Navy demonstration team. Did we just see an honor pass?" Another voice chimed in, urgent and reverent. "Marine pilot here, request permission to execute similar maneuver." Webb's smile widened, but his voice was firm as he keyed the mic. "All aircraft, negative on honor passes. That one was earned. That one was personal." As Kyle leveled the F-22 and began its climb, a deep satisfaction settled over him, warmer and more profound than any thrill he'd ever felt in the cockpit. Regulations could be rewritten, careers could be salvaged, but this moment, was singular. He'd given something to Frank Miller that no one else had in 7 decades. A salute that said, "I see you, I know what you did, you are not forgotten." The final demonstration pass was textbook, but it was irrelevant. The moment that would echo through time, captured in photographs and whispered about for years, had already happened. Below, the silence at Section 4 lingered, heavy with meaning. A boy, Robert Chen's grandson, stood close to his grandfather, his voice barely above a whisper. "That salute," he said, "was 60 years overdue." The words hung in the air, simple but profound, as the crowd began to stir again, their murmurs soft with reverence. Frank stood still, his eyes fixed on the F-22 as it vanished into the sky. The flag in his hands a symbol of a debt finally paid. A debt settled, not with words, but with the roar of a jet and the tilt of a wing at 400 miles per hour. As the air show's roar faded, a hush settled over the crowd, their eyes still fixed on the sky where the F-22 had just sliced through the air. Among them, a young airman, whose name tag read Jennings, stood motionless, his gaze locked on an elderly man, clutching a small, weathered American flag. Moments earlier, he'd brushed past this man, Frank, without a second glance, caught up in the rush of the event. Now something shifted. The airman's heart thudded with a dawning realization. A mix of awe and shame for his earlier indifference. His boots scuffed the ground as he approached, his voice low but steady, laced with a respect that felt new, almost unfamiliar. "Sir," he said, "that salute, was that for you?" Frank's throat tightened, emotion swelling, like a tide he couldn't hold back. He nodded, words failing him, his eyes glistening under the weight of decades unspoken. The airman's question lingered, heavy with curiosity and something deeper, reverence. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone no longer casual but urgent, as if he sensed he stood before someone who carried history in his bones. "Frank Miller," the old man managed, his voice rough but firm. "51st Fighter Wing, Korea." The words landed like a spark in dry grass. The airman's eyes widened, his mind racing back to flight school lectures, to grainy black and white photos of pilots who flew outdated planes against impossible odds. The 51st Fighter Wing. Oshryong, legends who held the line when hope was a faint flicker, who flew missions that textbooks now revered. This unassuming man, with his faded cap and quiet demeanor, was one of them. The airman's posture stiffened instinctively, and he snapped a crisp salute, his hands steady but his heart pounding with the weight of what he now understood. The gesture rippled outward, a silent current moving through the crowd. Heads turned, whispers faded, and eyes settled on Frank. A Vietnam veteran nearby, his own cap worn thin by years, slowly removed it and pressed it to his chest, his weathered face tight with unspoken pride. A young mother who moments before had been filming the F-22's wing dip on her phone, lowered it, her fingers trembling as she forgot the screen and simply watched, her heart swelling with a quiet reverence she couldn't name. Even a father who had earlier claimed Frank's usual spot by the fence without a thought, now approached with his 2 children in tow. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as he knelt to their level. "Kids," he said, "this is what a real hero looks like." His daughter clutched her plastic airshow flag tighter, her wide eyes fixed on Frank, while his son, barely 8, stood a little straighter, sensing something profound in the moment. Within minutes, the moment had wings of its own. Robert Chen's grandson, a teenager with a knack for social media, uploaded the video of the F-22's wing dip, a deliberate, graceful tilt that had honored Frank in front of thousands. Paired with a few lines about Frank's story, the post spread like wildfire. F-22 pilot salutes forgotten Korean War hero at air show, the caption read. The wing dip that made everyone cry. This is what happens when history honors history. Across the internet, people shared and reshared, their comments a chorus of awe and gratitude. The story reached screens far beyond the air show, touching hearts that had never heard of the 51st Fighter Wing but now felt its weight. 3 days later, national news outlets picked up the story. Reporters called Frank's small house on Maple Street, their voices eager for an interview. But Frank, who had lived 70 years in quiet humility, politely declined. Fame felt like a foreign language to him, one he had no desire to learn. He'd flown for duty, not headlines. In the simplicity of his life, his mornings with coffee and his evenings with old war letters was enough. Yet the Air Force Academy had other plans. A week after the air show, a letter arrived, its crisp envelope bearing the Academy's seal. Signed by the Commandant himself, it invited Frank to speak at the graduation ceremony. A handwritten note added, Mr. Miller, it's time for a new generation of pilots to hear from someone who truly understands what service means. Frank held the letter, his hands trembling not from age but from the weight of being seen after so long. For the first time in decades, he felt the pull to say yes, to step back into a world he'd left behind. On graduation day, Frank stood before 800 future Air Force officers, his old 51st Fighter Wing cap perched on his head, his suit simple but dignified. The auditorium was silent, every eye on him, every breath held. He didn't speak of glory or medals or the roar of jets over Korea. Instead, for 3 minutes, his voice steady and clear, he shared something deeper. I didn't fly for medals, he began, his gaze sweeping across the young faces, each one bright with ambition and uncertainty. I flew for the man in the cockpit next to me. I flew because someone had to, because there was a line to hold, and we held it. He paused, his eyes distant, seeing not the auditorium but the skies of decades past. When I came home, I thought that chapter was closed, that my time was done, but last week a young pilot reminded me that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It lives on every time someone chooses to remember, to honor, to salute not the rank, but the person who wore it. The applause erupted, a thunderous standing ovation that stretched for 5 minutes, echoing through the hall and into Frank's heart. He stood there, not basking in it, but humbled, feeling the weight of their respect like a warm hand on his shoulder. After the ceremony, Lieutenant Kyle Jennings, the young airman from the air show, found Frank in the parking lot. Their handshake was firm, a bridge between two eras, one who had flown through war's chaos, one who flew in peacetime's clarity. Thank you, Kyle said, his voice simple but heavy with meaning. Frank smiled, his eyes crinkling. Thank you for seeing me. From that day, Section 4 of the Western Fence at Edwards Air Force Base was reserved for veterans, marked by a small plaque, for those who flew before us. Every year, Frank returned to the air show, his small flag in hand, but he was never alone. The crowd parted for him, strangers became friends, and young pilots sought him out, their salutes no longer just gestures but promises to carry history forward. In a world that often races past its elders, chasing screens and fleeting moments, Frank's story was a quiet reminder. Some believe their time has passed, that they're mere shadows in a modern crowd. But then a wing tilts at just the right moment, and the truth shines through. No one is forgotten if they once lived for others. Frank Miller didn't need a medal or a statue. He needed only one young pilot to see him, to remind him and the world that service never fades. In the vast expanse of a cloudless California sky, the roar of an F-22 Raptor tore through the air show, its sleek form slicing the horizon as the crowd erupted in cheers. Families waved flags, children pointed skyward, and the ground vibrated with the pulse of jet engines. But near the edge of the spectacle, by a weathered metal fence, stood Frank Miller. an 84-year-old man whose quiet presence went unnoticed by most. His faded gray cap, tilted low over his brow, shaded eyes that had once scanned the skies of 1953 for enemy MiGs. In his gnarled hands, he clutched a small American flag, its edges frayed like the memories he carried. Frank believed himself a ghost in this modern world, a forgotten relic of a war that no longer stirred the hearts of the young. He came to the air show not for recognition, but to feel, for a fleeting moment, the rush of wings overhead, to remember Rodriguez's laughter, Morrison's steady voice, and Bobby Chen's grease-stained hands keeping their sabers aloft. As the F-22 screamed past for its third loop, something shifted. The jet's left wing dipped sharply, a deliberate tilt that sliced through the chaos of the crowd's noise. Frank's breath caught. His eyes, still sharp despite the years, locked onto the cockpit, and for a heartbeat, he saw the young pilot, Lieutenant Kyle Jennings, looking directly at him. The world seemed to pause, the roar of engines fading into a hum, as if the sky itself held its breath. Frank's chest tightened, not with fear, but with a flood of memory. The icy mornings over Korea, the crackle of Rodriguez's voice over the radio before it went silent forever. The lessons from Captain Morrison about reading the enemy's intent in the glint of their wings. That wing dip wasn't just a maneuver, it was a salute, a bridge across decades, a whisper that said, "I see you. I know what you gave." No one else in the crowd understood the gesture. Spectators clapped, oblivious to the silent exchange between two pilots, one whose war was history, the other whose future was shaped by it. But Frank felt it in his bones, a warmth that thawed the loneliness he'd carried for years. He stood a little straighter, his flag held a little higher, though his face remained shadowed under that old cap. For Kyle Jennings, that moment was a risk. He knew the maneuver was unauthorized, a breach of protocol that could cost him. But as he pulled the stick, his heart raced not with doubt, but with conviction. He'd spent months poring over records of Korean war pilots, driven by a need to understand the men who'd flown before him. Frank's name had surfaced in faded reports, a quiet hero who'd survived impossible odds. When Kyle spotted the old man by the fence, flag in hand, he didn't hesitate. He wanted Frank to know that his sacrifices hadn't vanished into the wind. 6 months later, Frank's small house on Maple Street became a quiet beacon for a new generation. Letters poured in from young pilots across the country, their words scrawled with gratitude. "Thank you for showing us what courage looks like when no one's watching," one read. "Your silence speaks louder than any medal," said another. Frank read each one in his worn armchair, his fingers tracing the paper as if touching the hands that wrote them. He never responded. He didn't trust his voice to carry the weight of his feelings, but he kept every letter in a wooden box by his bed. The visits started soon after. Young pilots, some still in flight school, would knock on his door, not for fame nor photos, but for the chance to sit with a man who understood the unspoken cost of duty. They'd share coffee on his porch, the silence between them filled with mutual respect. Frank listened to their dreams, their fears, and in their eyes he saw echoes of Rodriguez, of himself at 22, when the sky was both home and battlefield. Kyle Jennings, now Captain Jennings, faced consequences for his airshow stunt, but his commanding officer saw beyond the rulebook. "A pilot who honors the past like that," Colonel Marcus Webb said, "has the soul to lead others." Kyle's promotion came with a quiet nod of approval, and he carried it with pride, though he never spoke of the wing dip. He didn't need to. The story spread among pilots, a legend of instinct and respect. For Kyle, it wasn't about glory. It was about giving a man like Frank a moment to feel seen. He thought of his own grandfather, a mechanic who'd never sought the spotlight, and wondered if someone had ever saluted him in their own way. At Edwards Air Force Base, a small plaque in Section 4 became a shrine of sorts. It bore no grand inscription, just names and dates, but it drew aviation enthusiasts and veterans' families year-round. They came not only during air shows but on quiet weekdays, standing where history had saluted itself. Some left flowers, others coins, but all felt the weight of the place, a patch of earth where the past and present met. Frank visited once, driven by Robert Chen's grandson, a lanky teenager who'd recognized him at the air show. The boy, now carrying Bobby Chen's legacy in his own way, spoke little during the drive, but his eyes shone with pride. Frank placed a hand on the plaque, his fingers lingering over Bobby's name, and whispered, "You kept us flying, old friend." The boy watched, understanding more than his years should allow. Frank never spoke publicly again after addressing an academy graduation, where his halting words about duty and loss had left cadets silent. He preferred his backyard, where he'd sit under an oak tree on clear days, listening for the distant growl of jets. Sometimes, just sometimes, an aircraft would pass overhead, its wing tipping, ever so slightly. Frank would smile, his heart lifting, knowing it was no accident. Those salutes carried more than respect. They carried legacy, a thread connecting pilots across time. One day, a package arrived at his door, wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was the toy F-86 Sabre he'd given to a tearful boy years ago, now returned by a teenager whose childhood had been shaped by Frank's quiet kindness. With it came a note. "You showed me what it means to look up." Frank held the model, its paint chipped but intact, and felt a warmth that no metal could match. In those moments, as the sky stretched endless above, Frank knew his life wasn't measured by what he'd kept, but by the eyes still watching the horizon, waiting for a wing to dip in recognition. And that was enough.